Guys, this interview is going to be fascinating and really engaging, so stick around, and you might want to subscribe and hit the like button. Also, we really appreciate that. I also wanted to let you know, as I discuss a little bit with SG Anon in this show, I was recently recording just this past week with some world-class musicians, some new music, and I'm so stoked about what that's going to be. And if you're interested in hearing it, if you want to hear it, and be notified when it comes out, contact me via email at the link right there on the screen, and I will let you know when that first of that music is released. It's just going to be so good. And meanwhile, I want to let you know where you can find SG. That would be on Rumble at Q News Patriot with a green check mark, on X at SG Anon with a blue check mark, and on Truth Social at Real SG Anon with a red check mark. Here we go. I'm Carrington MacDuffie. This is Starseeds of Freedom, and I was just telling my guest that, you know, one of the ways I get through this time is through this podcast and the people that I get to talk to and hear from. And one of my favorite is my guest today, who I know you're going to be happy to hear from, and that's SG Anon, the Q News Patriot. And we'll get right to it. SG, thank you so much for being with us, and welcome to Starseeds of Freedom.
Thank you for having me, Carrington. Good to be back.
So, of course, I have a sheaf of questions in my scrawl, and I've had to write them and rewrite them numerous times because we've been trying to schedule this, and things happen so fast. I think this is the relevant question, and then the next day, no, that's ancient history. This is the relevant question. I'm going to start. We could avoid the election, but I'm not going to. I want to start with something you'd brought up in your last audio file, which I want to refer people to because his audio files are so awesome. And that is one of the idea you posited about how the election could go, which would be that the left would be able to rig it, not to win it, but to get, I guess, be close enough to question, Trump wins, right? To question his win, and that winds up that Trump does not get certified, and in that event, Congress is possibly coming under attack, you know, and that measures would have to be put into place for protection from civil war, should this happen, because, of course, Congress and everyone knows that will have known that Trump has won by a landslide, and anything else is a lie, right? What I wonder is, Congress would know that was an extremely dangerous thing to do. And so I'd like to know how those protections would be put in place, what do they consist of, and also wouldn't this signal extreme desperation because it would be so dangerous for them? Am I interpreting that correctly, do you think?
I would say so, Carrington. You know, at the end of the day, we have to remember that a lot of these people that are, you know, obstructing and preventing we the people from getting back into the rightful pulpits of power, they're sort of beholden to an agenda where the danger of the situation or the delicacy of the situation maybe doesn't matter, sort of as a zero sum type of conclusion. And here's what I mean by that. You take the average person and you tell them on Monday that on Friday they're going to die, that you've divined something from the Almighty or from the heavens, and that you are 100% assured that they're going to die. Or maybe perhaps they've divined that themselves, and so they very viscerally believe that. What happens then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in this individual's spectrum of time, when they consider the time that they have left, is really sort of immaterial. So in the same sense, if they are aware of an outcome that happens no matter what, if they are aware, and some of them are, that there's going to be exposure to child crimes, that there's going to be exposure to human smuggling and trafficking at the highest levels, that there's going to be exposure to weapons dealing, the selling of national security and state secrets, perhaps even access and other things like that to the U.S. government and more. If you're an individual that knows under a true transparent administration that seeks to peel back the hood and have a look underneath with every respective important department inside the U.S. government, we know that that's what's coming in a next Trump administration. It sort of doesn't matter for you how dangerous you play the game when the end result for you is jail time or worse either way. I think that's what we have at play right now, quite frankly, Carrington. And I do think that what we have being prepared in the landscape, and I think in many respects it's purposeful to a certain degree. Now, with respect to who's doing it, that's the real question at the end of the day. But it's certainly purposeful, and we have a landscape that has been allowed to be virtually unchanged since 2020, even despite the clear and massive presence of election fraud and election integrity and a risk of elections that are unclean and indeterminate and so tainted that it's impossible to figure out, who even received a certain number of votes relative to very small local precincts or counties. That I think is a fascinating component, because when you appreciate that on the other side of this election, we need to have an event or a series of events that allows for the USA to be properly returned to its correct authority. Because this is not just about 2020, right, Carrington? This is about election fraud in general. This is about how many at the state and local level of government, they didn't fraud themselves in post 2020. Many have been frauded in since the early 2000s. They perfected the system at the federal scale with the election of W. Bush in 2000, after we saw the Supreme Court basically put a stop to a recount that was going to declare Gore as the proper presidential winner. So looking at what's going on now with respect to this upcoming election, and back to your initial question, is it extremely dangerous and unbelievably ill-advised and stupid on its face for the Congress to get involved and attempt to disqualify, and that's what I believe is a very real possibility here, a presidential candidate who has won at the ballot box, if they're able to say that the election was not clean and that this individual has already been accused of being involved in insurrection before, and we don't even know if there might be an insurrection happening right now. I think that's a very plausible scenario to come from the mouths of those who stand to walk a very dark pathway, no matter what, on the other side of this.
Indeed, and so they would have to put in some protections. What is the mechanism for that to protect themselves from attack? I mean, are we talking about going underground or?
Well, there's a lot of different ways that the government can be insulated or take measures to insulate itself. And it really depends upon, each respective federal department and which jurisdiction they fall underneath. Ultimately, the Congress of the United States falls underneath the protection of the U.S. Capitol Police, the FBI/DOJ, the U.S. Marshals, and if necessary, the U.S. military can be deployed to protect the Capitol. And of course, Congress is in the Capitol because the Capitol is foreign soil. So you can deploy, regular troops upon that soil to protect that soil. That's something that Americans have only learned at scale really over the last 4 to 5 years, the fact that that's even jurisdictionally allowable and possible, and it is.
Yeah.
With respect to actual measures that would be taken, I think what you would have is 24/7 protection offered by a cadre of different agencies, including the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, the DOJ, the U.S. Capitol Police, and others. It's possible that you would have maybe some ancillary military involvement with some of that vis-a-vis the National Guard post that's there on the ground in Washington, D.C. FEMA can also install protective equipment, build buildings and shelters, and funnel the government and representatives of the government to safe houses and predetermined rallying points in times of national crisis or attack. As you highlighted a moment ago, a great deal of those are underground. Most people think of things like Cheyenne Mountain as a good example of a type of bunker that you would take a government to go to insulate them. There are actually several in and around the United States. There's one under Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. There's one under the Air Force Base. I believe it's Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. There's one under the Denver Airport. There's one under Baltimore, Maryland, believe it or not. It's just right up the road from Washington, D.C. So with respect to those measures, there's a lot of different things that they could employ. What I find fascinating, Carrington, is we've seen in the last 15 months a number of very interesting behaviors happening both surrounding the Congress and coming from the Congress with respect to preservation of optical continuity of the government itself. We saw satellite phones issued to a portion, but not all
but not
of the
all.
of the congressional makeup about 15 months ago. We've
I
seen Congress fast track just in the last 60 days legislation out of committee and out for a regular vote within the actual chambers to discuss filling congressional seats in the House and Senate in a rapid fire format, bypassing traditional nomination protocols and policies in the case of needing to fill the seats to preserve government continuity. So, looking at these types of things, and then we have the New York Times about a month and a half, 2 months ago, running an article titled that the U.S. Marshals and Secret Service are there to facilitate the continuity of government. We clearly have a situation being prepared both in the narrative space, but I would argue in the kinetic space in many regards for an optical, essentially an overt, a going overt, a popping from underneath the surface. I would characterize it as when people watch that movie, The Hunt for Red October, and they do an emergency blow in that submarine towards the very end of the movie. It bursts out from the seawater. You never saw it coming. You couldn't tell where it was going to come from, but it came out and it was very fast. It was very rapid. It was very powerful, and it was very dominating in the attention grabbing sort of fashion, very dramatic. And I think that's exactly what we have coming for us here in the United States.
And a couple things you said there made me think of, well, insurrection and also being in a position to repopulate Congress in the case of the Brunson case, which I just love the idea of the Brunson case, but it feels too good to be true. But that would also be a possible thing that they'd be preparing for. I don't know. And the other thing that whenever I hear about an insurrection, it just is the absurdity of that. I've been corresponding with a J6er who's incarcerated, and the information coming from him, and I'm not at liberty to disclose who he is, and I don't have his letter in front of me that I wanted to refer to. Maybe that in the next talk that we have, if it's still relevant, if he hasn't been pardoned and released. But just regarding an insurrection and what those prisoners are going through and how they're treated and the prison system, I wasn't going to go off on this, but I just have to mention that the way the prison system works is so insane. And it's all about money. It's all, there are all these measures that have been introduced but are not enforced that allow these prisoners to have extra time taken off their sentence for good behavior, but they don't actually enforce those new laws. And because the system of the prison system makes more money if the prisoners are still there. Oh, there's so much to correct. It's just unbelievable. I'm sorry, I went on a side note there, but regarding the election still, I want to ask you straight out what you think about this regarding the white hats purportedly being in control, and that's something else that I wanted to talk about a little bit more about later too. But in this case, do you think the white hats are running Kamala and Tim Walz because they're just so bad that it seems like they can't be that stupid? And I just wonder how that strikes you, and if you have any background on that. What do you think about that?
You know, they're absolutely running the show behind Biden. And I don't think that we can conclude logically that Kamala could be that close to that orbit and not also be part of that operation. There's a very compelling video that came out. Actually, it was recorded during the State of the Union, I believe in 21. It might have been 22, which clearly shows a pigmentation shift of a dramatic kind in the neckline on Kamala Harris. You can
Yes.
clearly see a delineation between two types of skin there. And so either we have someone who spent a lot of time in the reverse tan, or we have someone who is behind some sort of a prosthesis or something that is designed to carry forward a particular message. And it's worth noting that I've said for a while, Carrington, that we have those types of assets or resources or operators or operatives or whatever you want to call it, working on both sides of the
Yes.
proverbial good bad coin.
Yes.
Another example of that, quite frankly, and I know that this is something that sort of meets with scorn and disdain from the more intellectual audience out there, is the fact that I believe JD Vance is also a 2.0. at this particular stage in the game. The original Vance tracks more than 8 inches shorter, according to records that we were able to find online, to the actual individual that is JD Vance now. Whether or not it's a clone, whether or not it is an actor, whether or not we will ever know, and I
Yeah.
doubt that we will. I think we have to acknowledge that there is a reorientation process that is being driven forward inside the U.S. government and the U.S. national political landscape, oftentimes by sleight of hand tactics, and that includes individuals that may be playing a part or individuals that may be their original selves, but are in a submission deal that allows them, or excuse me, that does not allow them to operate organically. Um,
Right.
Looking at this particular process, Carrington, the Harrison Waltz thing, which is the basis, the junction of your initial question there, that particular um, um, most recent iteration of this tactic that I would term seems to be the most obvious. I'm not 100% certain about Waltz, although I can certainly say that we have patriotic actors that are running the narrative machine that is behind Waltz, because we've managed to just absolutely destroy this individual's reputation in front of the modern world in less than 6 weeks' time. So that tells us that we have tremendous narrative control, and I think a great deal of seeding came out purposefully done, probably by DOD, if I could be so brash to suggest that, to allow that narrative seed to organically run. But with respect to Kamala as an individual, and I'm going to dial back in on her, I think Kamala is part of the play, is part of the show, is part of the operative plan. Whether or not that is to drag people like Waltz out and put them in the spotlight, and I think that's entirely possible, or whether it is merely to desecrate and destroy the electability and even the tastefulness in many regards, the taste association of the Democrat Party to the American appetite, I think that remains to be seen.
Well, along those same lines, then, I wonder what you think about whether or not we're seeing the OG Trump, because I've heard that he maybe have been in Cheyenne Mountain for a long time, and that there could be a few different Trumps, one run by the White Hats, one run by the left. I don't know. It's such a crazy play. Uh, and if it's not the OG Trump, then he's good at channeling him. The one, for instance, that we just saw interviewed by Joe Rogan. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting. That particular topic is one that I've been investigating over the last 24 hours, and your show is the first show that I'm going to take a position on this issue with respect to the Rogan podcast. When I did a reference across a number of different, I mean, it was like a dozen and a half videos of Trump from the 80s and the 90s, and then that particular podcast, various moments throughout that podcast, there is an indistinguishable quality in the nasality of the voice. So what we have there, I believe, is the original Trump on Joe Rogan. I think we have Trump 1.0, whether he's, come forward from a protected area, could be Cheyenne, whether he's been out the whole time. Again, that's another angle to these types of conversations, Carrington, that I don't think we'll ever truly know.
Yeah.
But what I think we can say is that that was absolutely the original Trump on Rogan, original 1.0 good guy Trump, or maybe, bad guy turned good guy. There's all sorts of different stories behind it. Doesn't really matter at this stage in the game. And he confirmed in that podcast that there are, excuse me, doubles being deployed pertaining directly back to him without directly confirming it. Rogan asked him specifically how he had or how long it had been since he'd played golf, or when was the last time he'd played golf, something like that.
Right.
And he
Yes.
said, I don't know, it's been a while. And then Rogan said, well, you went right after you got shot, or something along those lines.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Trump said, oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right, I did go.
That's right.
So that is clearly us being told without being told that there are doubles, decoys, and other assets that are involved in this, taking the likeness of Trump, just as there are with Hillary and Clinton, and I would argue even in some respects Sean Combs at this stage in the game, because he doesn't even look like the original Combs from just 2 or 3 months ago.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Q tells us, Carrington, and I take a lot of my inspiration online from that entity known as Q. There is a drop that reads plainly that not all will be publicly prosecuted for the betterment of the country, but no one will get away. So, looking at that particular angle and understanding that we do have to get as many of the soccer balls of the consciousness over the line at the exact same time, at the exact same moment, what you would call singularity or the point of convergence in a quantum sense, it makes a lot of sense that you would sort of take the good with the bad as long as you can continue to move down the field in the direction towards victory at the end of the day, because victory at the end of the day is the only way that you secure the transparency and secure this American experiment and indeed liberty for the world into the future.
Right. And so these different tactics have to be used, and there are so many layers of reality and of deceit that will never be sorted out, and as you say, don't ultimately matter. And I don't ask about that for sort of gossip reasons, except really more to look at, wow, the number of the uncountable layers that we'll never know about, and how we, there's a lot of stuff you just got to shine it on and keep your eye on the prize. You know, as my father told me, the last thing he said when he dropped me off at boarding school was, keep your cool and keep your eye on the ball. And that always stuck with me. And that's what's called for, I feel like. So, um, this question of who's who, it's only, it's only worth so much, except in that the reality we're dealing with, we know is a very flexible one, and we keep our eye on the prize. But speaking of Q, also, am I right in understanding? I heard somewhere that the um, Q unfolds in reverse order, and that's maybe why. And if that's the case, then I was wondering, is that why we might be seeing Hillary at this point with this book thing or whatever she's doing? What is the story? I don't know where I heard that. Does it go in reverse order?
Well, it's really interesting. The story that you've probably heard as a predicate to your question likely goes alongside the line of the last parts of the Q story came out first. And so the
That's what it
drops were sort
is.
of written back to front.
Right.
And it's an interesting, characterization, but I gotta say, Carrington, that characterization doesn't exactly capture the essence, in my opinion, of what's going on with the Q operation and the Q movement itself. It is absolutely a time cipher. And we know that because we have time gaps and correlations and, zero deltas and 2-second deltas and 10-second deltas and these types of things. In other words, impossibly close and proximal in linear time, that they cannot be unrelated. And they're all through the Q drops with Trump and with Scavino and a whole host of other individuals across the US government, some of whom Q says are not exactly the nicest of people, but chose to play ball to save their own skin.
Hmm.
I've come to believe, after analyzing this for a number of years now, that the Q operation is a non local time cipher. And so, what that is, or a non linear time cipher, and what that is it is a cipher based on potentiality of events. And potentiality can only be contrived based out of quantum momentum, for lack of a better term. In other words, if you have 50 million people, all of the same mindset at a quantum level, you're going to generate a potentiality gradient that is very high.
Yes.
Whatever they have in relation to their intended desire and agreement is probably going to come about because you have a huge quantity of hands, feet, energy, bodies, minds that are going to come together, and they're going to make that happen. So Q is a potentiality cipher essentially, because as timelines converge, which is what happens when potentials are zeroed out. In other words, the potential of a Trump assassination zeroed on the 13th of July when it became a physical reality. So it's no longer a potential, it's a reality at that point. It's been realized into the physical world. The same is true of this entire Great Awakening military civilian alliance journey that all of us are on and that all of us are a part of. As the timelines converge and zero out potentials, certain time ciphers that tie back to those drops will become relevant, even if they are not yet relevant. That's why they can't figure Q out. That's why we can't figure Q out, because it is impossible to predict outside of using the techniques that were utilized to spawn that operation to begin with.
And that's what's so thrilling about these times. Not only everything that's happening, but this convergence, and that it includes the nature of time itself, which clearly we don't really understand, or we don't live as if we understand it. So I just think that's thrilling. Um, so, but again, with reference to Q, is there a plan, or is there anywhere in the drops referring to? Okay, I'm going to just go for a moment to the illegal immigrants, the sleeper cells, the likelihood to certainty, really, speaking of what you were speaking of terrible things or thing happening as we finish out this war, and one of them being, acts of terrorism from sleeper cells being activated. Is there anything in the Q drops or about cell phone tracking, deportation? And maybe you've covered this before and I missed it, though I follow you pretty closely, but is there anything there about that in the drops?
Off the top of my head, it would take me a minute to remember the rest of the drop, but there was a drop that discussed Antifa and BLM and the fact that all of them are constantly being tracked and have been getting tracked since the launch of the transition period after the election of 2016, because NSA recognized Trump as the lawful, duly elected president of the country, even as some of those other agencies inside the US government were seeking to destroy exactly that. So, with respect to that, it would only be a little bit speculative at this particular point, except to say, and I'm not really able to say a whole lot about it because I ended up coming to this awareness unintentionally and inadvertently. I was ancillary to a conversation that I don't think I should have heard so much about. There are tracking operations that are happening on the ground with respect to the migrant invasion inside the United States. But the institutions and organizations that are actually doing that tracking, a lot of people would not recognize. If they were to know that, publicly, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. There's a lot of contractor work. There's a lot of third, fourth, and fifth party work, sort of like 6 degrees from Kevin Bacon kind of thing. But with respect to that, the cyber component, the tracking component, which is really the ability to geolocate cyber devices, and that's primarily what we're talking about, the surveillance state, that has been at play since at least the days of Snowden. So we know if we're under a continuity of government national emergency, and I believe that we are, if we're under a situation that clearly gives us evidence to show that there's something extraordinary happening inside the US government, and I believe that we are, and it would make a great deal of sense that individuals, any and all, from anywhere on the planet that are here within this country seeking to do the republic harm would also end up in the same type of dragnet that is being cast over the rest of the country to insulate, protect, and secure it during those same continuity operations. So, in other words, I'm sort of using a little bit of contrived logic to answer your question, but
Yeah.
my contrived logic says if we're under those conditions, how can we possibly facilitate or allow the facilitation of an invasion of this country and the military not be taking preemptive steps from day one?
Good question. I mean, that's kind of how it has to be, right? I see why you're coming to that conclusion. Thank you for that. And that's hopeful. Still speaking on the topic of really the warfare that we're involved in immediately here in this country, um, the weather warfare. I You were talking in your audio file about how Hurricane Milton was suddenly at the last minute seemed to be well, it just cooled down. And my understanding is that there's a technology that the White Hats use to affect that, which is to send up golf ball sized chunks of dry ice, probably hundreds of thousands of them, up into the storm to cool it down, and that's why there was this sudden cooling down of the storm. And so it seems to me that weather warfare is one of the final weapons, and obviously we have two sides, right? And the Q or white hats being in control, they're still at the same time, as you've always pointed out, are dealing with an event-driven procession of events. So we have both going on, right? We have a battle clear out in plain sight, and then we also have this. Yeah, I'm not even really sure what my question is, except I see both happening at the same time, and maybe this is part of the convergence of timelines, where it does seem the white hats are in control, and the Q drops have been saying this for so long, and at the same time we're involved in this war where we can tamp down the storm, but we can't make it entirely go away. So they're both happening at once. Do you see this as the convergence of timelines? How?
I see this, well, fundamentally at a macroscopic level, that answer I think is yes. And that's what I purport to say, that that's what leads to the flow of our reality, out from coming forth from the Holy Spirit itself. But with respect to specific, events that we have going on here on the ground in this particular day and in this particular time, Carrington, what we're seeing evidenced out through these FEMA situations that are happening out of the Carolinas, through the situation coming out of Florida with respect to Milton. I believe it is the evidence of interagency and in many cases intra-agency warfare that has been made possible by a devolution of the chain of command structure inside the U.S. government from the very top. We cut off a great deal of the maestros that were giving the orders and providing the context and the game board necessary for all of the little peons to do what they needed to do inside of the corruption suppression machine. Once those were removed or made, inviable through a submission deal or through an actual physical removal or what have you, then you end up with a great deal of directionlessness from those same groups that understand if they're ever put under the microscope, if sunlight is ever brought to their behavior, to their institution, to them personally, that they're going to jail. And in many cases, I think many of them, Carrington, would go away for a long time. I've heard interesting reports with respect to these hurricanes, and we've certainly seen the weather warfare. The geoengineering was highlighted in real time by some incredibly credentialed researchers online, one of whom was Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was heavily involved in that particular exposure process in real time with Helene and then again with Milton. And at the same time, I think we have evidence to show that Milton was supposed to be a much more catastrophically powerful storm. And we saw U.S. Air Force C-130s flying through the eye wall of that storm nonstop as it came across the Gulf of Mexico, and we don't know what they were there for. Is it possible that they were attempting to counteract the microwave effects from a HARP heating atmospheric weapon by seeding the clouds with physical elements that would disappoint the heat structure and the heat currents? I think that is a completely plausible scenario.
Yeah.
I think it is also plausible that they were there to accelerate the bad acting. We really don't know.
Yeah.
What we do know
Well,
is that right before it slammed into the coast, it had a dramatic weakening effect, which was really unplanned for. There were a lot of people that had left the coastal area that were very surprised that when they returned home, their homes were not as destroyed as they anticipated them to be. Many in that area remember Hurricane Charlie from 20 years ago, which slammed into the peninsula and just destroyed several areas there around St. Petersburg and a little bit further south. So looking at this landscape, Carrington, I think it's entirely possible, and this is the problem of a disinformation espionage war. It is entirely possible, but almost impossible to conclude for certain what was going on with respect to patriotic actors actually being involved in acting on our behalf, fighting on our behalf with that particular event. But we've seen some reports coming out of the Carolinas, and I myself have seen one report that seems very credible to suggest that an organized force, potentially soldiers, we can't really tell from the video that was sent to me, but they're definitely organized and coordinated, and they move as a team. They were engaging federal assets, and those federal assets are not named in the video, but reports from on the ground would suggest that we would potentially have FEMA at the other end of that firefight.
That's what I was hearing, that we actually had some militias that had, and that there were, I think, sheriffs saying, "Get your guns, folks," you know. And when I heard that, I really prayed that it was true because um, that's how we even launched this whole ideal, this as yet unrealized ideal in the first place, was just, handmade, homemade militias. So I thought that, I mean, I was thrilled. I was really, uh, and that, that's why I have this flag, which we don't really know. There's so much about our history that we don't know, and flags can signify so many different things. But for me, I'm allowing this to signify that for me because because it's thrilling, and that's what I really want to. That's what I want the truth to be. That ideal that we're still fighting for, and even just fighting for it here in a podcast. Well, I have more questions for you, and I actually don't know what your time frame is. So before I launch, before I choose how much more I can ask you, tell me how much time you have.
We're looking at maybe 8, 10 more minutes or
Okay,
so.
okay. Then let me address, I just only had a chance to skim the takeaways from that BRICS meeting, the BRICS summit. And the one that caught my attention the most was that Putin was pushing for some kind of ethical guidelines for artificial intelligence. And I feel like I'm having this conversation all the time, especially with musicians. I was just recording in Nashville, and the guys I was recording with, we were talking about AI, how it's affecting music. They all have young children. What is the world going to look like for their children? And always we know regulation is way behind the curve when it comes to any kind of technological developments. And I was wondering, and we know also it's increasing, I've heard at 500% a year without um, any regulation on it. So as a father and just as an analyst, where are you with this? What are you thinking about this? Uh, just any comment that you want to make on it, I'd be really happy to hear.
Well, with respect to the AI itself, this is one of the most compelling and most dangerous parts of the transition period from an old way of living to a new way of living. And I would liken this, Carrington, to things like the printing press, the cotton gin, steam power, harnessable electricity, harnessable and controllable gas flow. These were things that were extremely dangerous and original when they were first pioneered, first brought about. And yet, over time, they were perfected. I would argue if we take the corruption out of the system, a great deal of them could be used for a great, many wonderful things. So,
Hmm.
an AI is another good example of that. We're looking at, a post-industrial revolution. It's sort of a quantum revolution technology. AI is the underpinning for a lot of quantum capable systems. And you would need hyper advanced algorithmic processing and computing power and machine learning power that's controllable, but definitely there in order to manage a quantum world. We need to redefine how commerce works in many regards. We need to
Yeah.
redefine how the retail work and wage sector actually works. AI can be a tool to dramatically drop cost. And even though you have a lot of people that say, well, it will take our jobs. Well, yes, in some regards, that is true. But in other industries, and I would argue in most industries, especially those that are reliant entirely on creativity and inspiration and artistic uniqueness, those industries are always going to need people. They'll have people. I think they're going to become much more precious, much more valuable, much more revered and respected because they require very talented people and people that are, for all intents and purposes, Carrington, very genuinely and transparently human in and of their own right. And looking at what the AI can do to the economic and industrial sector, especially looking at manufacturing long term, you're going to need people in those arenas. You need people in finance. You need people in business. You always need a human hand to make sure that whatever is happening, there always needs to be a human hand on the wheel. Maybe that's the best way to say this. But you can dramatically increase the lucrativity, if I can make that word up for
I
a
like it.
moment, the ability for people to earn high wages relative to effort when you have reduced cost effectively, reliably, and consistently over the long period for the long term with a new industrial or revolutionary advancement. So I would caution people, AI, quantum capable computing, machine learning, algorithms that are capable of cascading and escalating levels of complexity, things of that nature. They are tenuous to mess with and to bring out into the world, and yet I think that they're also at the same time they represent a way for us to build a new Earth physically, build a new Earth economically, build a new Earth, and even in some cases maybe spiritually, because you're talking about freeing up a great deal of the human time, day to day to day to focus on things that are fulfilling, that feed that spiritual side. But we always have to have our wits about us. We need to be alert about it, and we need a human hand on the wheel at all times. And I think that's sort of the balance that we're attempting to strike right now in this period of time. And if I may, just to close this particular segment, Carrington, that's another consideration when you look at the military commentary with respect to this so-called Q operation. And these things like it had to be done this way, it needed to take this so much time, yada yada yada. One of the reasons that I think you could have, or that you have a properly timed military intervention pertaining to corruption in the world, is because you could actually, in this period of time that we're in right now, if you were a rogue state, a rogue actor, a criminal cartel with unfettered access to military and paramilitary forces, you could utilize AI for some incredible and unrecoverable chaos.
Yeah, true enough. And yet, what you've said is also heartening. And we have the blockchain. That's another subject there isn't time for today. But um, my thoughts about I don't understand. I mean, I'm not a programmer, but I am a creator. So what I see is what you were pointing to. I think the most important piece of that is that AI can't channel God force energy. It's just computation and synthesis of information that's been fed to it. And actual inspiration has to come through another channel. And that's what we can do. So um, maybe our jobs get better.
Well, I look at it, and to be perfectly honest, Carrington, my personal view on any revolutionary technological or industrial advancement is that it is a tool, and it can be utilized in whichever way one would utilize a tool. One can utilize a hammer to build a house or commit a crime.
Yeah.
One can utilize a gun to save a young lady who's having, a life-threatening moment of vulnerability, or to cause that very life-threatening moment of vulnerability.
Yeah.
So the AI situation, I look at it very much in the same fashion. And when you marry it with concepts like blockchain, like incorruptible digital tokenization tied back to barcoded physical tangible assets that are unreachable and hyper secure all around the planet, you could affect the underpinning for a remarkable liberty preservation and expansion infrastructure rather than the other way around.
Yes, yes, it could be an explosion, really, of liberty, freed from the tasks that are really beneath us and beneath our potential, which, they've been trying to keep us under that thumb for a long time. So maybe that's what really awaits us, though I'm not sure that I want to have my brain chipped or be injected with anything. You know, Thank you anyway, though. Really appreciate it. Well, and speaking of thank you, and I'm glad that we finally got to connect. I've got so many more questions, so we'll connect again. There's a lot looming right now, and so I just want to say, everybody stay cool, and SG offers such a calming perspective. And I know that, in our own lives, we run around and, we have our crazy moments, but when we settle down and really talk about things, it's possible to do it calmly, and you really contribute so much to that. And I so appreciate it. And I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Carrington. God bless. Looking forward to coming back.